Welcome to my channel. My name is Man on the Wall. I talk about history, politics, and whatever else I feel like that day. And with the surprise breakout success of my Henry Kissinger video, I've decided to try and make more of an effort to put out content. This time, we're going back to attacking tankies. On the chopping block today, we have Spooky Scary Socialist, an ML content creator who I associate most with his proud, unironic simping for Hakeem, who I've already made a video about. Based on our interactions in DMs, he seems like a pretty nice guy for the most part. So if by any chance he happens to stumble across this video, no hard feelings? The video we're going to look at today is, quote-unquote, was Stalin really that bad? Yes. The answer is yes, but he's going to say that the answer is no. So, let's take a look.
So, Stalin has always been a contentious point for people in the left and the general public. And since my audience is virtually zero right now, it makes sense to make this video earlier instead of later. Whenever I tell anyone in real life that I'm a socialist, they always say something like, "Oh, so you support evil dictators that killed tens of millions of people like Stalin, right?" And I'm like, boy, I just said that I prefer collective ownership of the means of production. How do you jump from that to me supporting Stalin?
So, a number of things. First off, Stalin isn't really a contentious figure on the left. Really, with the exception of ML, and not even all MLs, as Titoists and Trotskyists do exist, basically the entire left is in agreement with the notion that Stalin was a ruthless dictator who killed millions of people. This isn't Black Book of Communism propaganda. This is a pretty clear, unambiguous historical fact, and the only people who seek to deny it are people with a clear political bias. As far as people immediately thinking of Stalin when you say that you're a socialist, well, yeah, that is a problem, but the absolute last way to solve that problem is to defend Stalin or his crimes.
You can hear the rhetoric everywhere. Stalin killed 60 million people, or 50 million people, or 40. Basically, it isn't hard to find huge death counts in the tens of millions. But when you look deeper at these numbers, you'll begin to find that there are two camps. According to Europe A History by Norman Davies, Stalin killed around 50 million people. Let's keep that information tucked in our little chart here. According to that history judged by Roy Medvedev, Stalin killed millions. R.J. Rummel says that 43 million is Stalin's death count. In Health and Social Change in Russia and Eastern Europe by William C. Cockerham, he says that Stalin killed at least 50 million people, citing Norman Davies from earlier. According to Stalinist Terror, New Perspectives, edited by Getty and Manning, there were only 9.5 million surplus deaths during the 1930s. And, according to Victims of Soviet Terror, there were 8 to 9 million deaths during the 30s. Even if we adjust these estimates to apply only to the 1930s, there's still a huge difference with these estimates. The higher number camp has an average of 20 million deaths for the 1930s, while the lower number camp has 8.5 million deaths for the 1930s. The paper, Victims of the Soviet Penal System in the Pre-War Years, uses official archival data to refute and confirm old conclusions, specifically about the Great Purges. According to the paper, the long-awaited archival evidence on the repression in the period of the Great Purges shows that the level of arrests, political prisoners, executions, and general camp populations tend to confirm the orders of the magnitude indicated by those labeled as revisionists and mocked by those proposing higher estimates.
Okay. So, the death toll of Stalin, like the death toll of many major criminals against humanity, is disputed, and there's no one answer to how many people he killed. And it's true that a lot of right-leaning sources have overinflated Stalin's death toll, mostly by including deaths caused by a fall in birth rates, i.e. people who would have been born if not for Soviet mismanagement of certain issues, which I don't think is an entirely fair way of deciding a death toll, as those people weren't exactly killed per se, even if they might have lived not for certain policies carried out by Stalin's Soviet Union. So, yes, the people who are saying that 20 or 30 million people were killed by Stalin are being hyperbolic to some extent. So, what is Stalin's real death toll? Well, according to this table in Wikipedia, if we add up the 600,000 deaths from dekulakization, a low estimate courtesy of Manfred Holdemor, the roughly 1 million deaths from the Great Purge, a median estimate made from the numbers proposed by Michael Ellman, the roughly 1.6 million people killed in the gulags, again courtesy of Ellman, the 520,000 people killed from population transfers, such as the deportation of the Chechens during the Second World War, courtesy of books by Michael Ricken and Cynthia Buckley, the 22,000 killed in the Cad Massacre, which, yes, was committed by the Soviets, not the Nazis. That's something they admitted in 1990. The roughly 3.5 million people killed in the Holdemor, deemed the most likely estimate by Wikipedia, and the approximately 1.5 million killed in the Kazakh famine, we get a death toll of roughly 8.75 million people. However, this only includes deaths that were caused within the Soviet borders. While I don't think it's fair to include the deaths of everyone the Soviets killed on the Eastern Front in the Second World War, since it was a response to an attempted invasion and genocide by Nazi Germany, I do think it's fair to include the death toll from events such as the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939, the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states in 1940, and of course, the Winter War, as part of Stalin's death toll, as all four of these events were aggressive acts on the part of the Soviet Union. So, the Soviet invasion of Poland killed roughly 8,000 people in total, 5,500 Poles and 2,500 Soviets, roughly. The Soviet pacification of the Baltic states following their occupation killed roughly 125,000 Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, and that's a low estimate, and the Winter War was estimated to have killed 175,000 people, 150,000 Soviets, and 25,000 Finns. So, with those numbers added up, we get a death toll of roughly 9 million, which even then is a low estimate compared to others, and ignores things like, for example, the deaths caused in the Korean War, which was started in part due to Stalin giving Kim Il-sung the green light to invade South Korea, the deaths caused in guerrilla conflicts in the Baltic states and Ukraine, and the purges and crimes committed by Soviet-installed governments in Eastern Europe during Stalin's reign. So even if we are to acknowledge that certain neoconservative dipshits inflate the number of deaths to be a lot higher than they actually are, that doesn't change the fact that Stalin has, without question, one of the biggest kill counts of any leader in the 20th century, with only a few others being able to match him.
The paper goes on to refute old claims about the terror targeting specific nationalities and confirm that only a minority were imprisoned for political reasons. It also confirms that the purges mainly targeted elites and was characterized by general confusion.
Okay, so, a few things. One is the notion that ethnic minorities weren't targeted in the Great Purge is just flat not true. There were multiple NVKD operations against ethnic minorities who were suspected of being fifth-column fascist sympathizers, including, but not limited to, Germans, Greeks, Koreans, Finns, Latvians, and most notably the Poles, who made up 12.5% of the victims of the purge, despite being 0.4% of the population, whose extermination was ordered by NVKD Order Number 485. As far as the purge's victims being made up mostly of elite groups, major party members, army officials, intelligentsia, etc., well, that is true, but for one, that doesn't justify them being murdered, and two, they weren't murdered because they were elites. They were murdered because they were, or were suspected of being, political enemies of Stalin, and were mostly killed for politically opportunistic reasons cloaked under the guise of ludicrous supposed acts of treason they only admitted to after being tortured.
Gulags are often compared to Nazi death camps, but this is an unfair comparison. According to the paper from earlier, when looking at official archival evidence, many of the inmates in the Gulag camps were freed and death rates were low. Only a minority of the inmates were convicted of being counter-revolutionary, with most being there for general crimes. Although it is important to take these distinctions with a grain of salt, this also opens up an important dialogue about why we shouldn't count all arrests in the Soviet penal system, because some were just arrests of general criminals that would have been arrested anyway in a Western society. So, Gulag camp populations are more comparable to US prison populations, which ironically most people arguing about gulags probably don't care about.
So, a couple of things. I do agree with Triple S's notion that the gulags are not comparable to the death camps, largely because the gulags were not intentionally and specifically designed to murder everyone who came within its path. But the notion that the death toll in the gulag was low is ludicrous. While accounts vary, most agree that anywhere from 1 to 2.5 million people were killed there. As far as many of the people there being petty criminals, well, that is true, but that doesn't even come close to justifying the brutal, often fatal conditions they were subjected to. I mean, as Triple S correctly points out, many of the people in the US prison system are petty criminals, and that doesn't justify the brutal, often slave-like conditions they face. So why is it any different when it comes to the Gulag? Though I don't think these two are equivocal, because as brutal as the US prison system is, to my knowledge, it does not have a death toll in the millions. After this, Triple S goes on attacking those who say Stalin was worse than Hitler. I'm going to skip this part because I basically agree with him.
Though the Nazis and Soviets didn't have a non-aggression pact, that was only after Stalin tried and failed to form an anti-Nazi coalition with Britain and France, who were following a policy of appeasement to Germany.
So, a few things. It is true that, in terms of consequences, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact really wasn't all that different from things like the Munich Agreement, for example. But that still doesn't change the fact that the Soviets openly collaborated with the Nazis in helping them commit one of their worst crimes, the invasion of Poland, and sat idly back as Hitler ravaged Europe and genocided the Poles when they could have done something. If, instead of deciding to focus their military efforts on the disastrous Winter War campaign, they had pushed into Nazi-occupied Poland, the threat of a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe could have pressured the British and the French into pursuing a more serious push into Germany proper, forcing Hitler into that two-front war he feared.
For the pleb tier viewers who don't know what the Holdemor is, it's essentially a famine that took place in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, often attributed to Stalin. However, many like to call the Holdemor a genocide caused by Stalin, and it's very strange to do that when there was already a poor harvest at the time. Stalin's policies did play a role in the famine, I'm not denying that. He requisitioned grain in large amounts, and this happened to affect Ukraine worse because they were an important agricultural center. However, this wasn't deliberately targeted at Ukraine, and this can be seen in the way that other parts of Russia suffered as well.
So, the question about the Holdemor being a genocide is very complicated, and there aren't a lot of easy answers. But I do feel as if Triple S is strawmanning the case for genocide. Most people who say that the Holdemor was a deliberate or enforced famine don't say that Stalin literally created the famine, but intentionally mismanaged the famine to literally starve out any potential for a movement for an independent Ukrainian state, as the famine disproportionately affected Ukraine to a massive extent. Was this his intent? Nobody really knows, but given the fact that Stalin continued to export grain even when people were starving, the criminalization of gleaning, and the fact that barriers were put in place to prevent the starving Ukrainians from leaving the country, does suggest that this is a legitimate possibility.
While the United States and other capitalist countries were suffering from the Great Depression, the Soviet Union was doing fine and its planned economy was growing reliably each year. Compared to the bigotry of the United States, the Soviet Union was also great in terms of race relations. As civil rights activist Paul Robeson put it, "In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi, no color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being." So, if you were a person of color, poor, or a member of the working class, you would actually be thriving in the Soviet Union.
So, a few things. One, I don't know if I would say that people in a country are exactly thriving when they're facing mass famines, political purges, and the possibility of being deported if they're of a certain ethnicity, or worked to death if they commit a petty crime. Secondly, the notion that race relations were good under Stalin is nothing short of laughable. Even ignoring the possibility that Stalin intentionally mismanaged the Holdemor in order to literally starve out the Ukrainian population, you have everything from the specific targeting of ethnic minorities by the NVKD to the deportation of ethnic minorities like the Chechens and the Ingush during the Second World War to Siberia, with millions dying on the way. This wasn't exactly a post-racial paradise, if you know what I mean. It is true that there was no significant prejudice against African Americans, but that was because Russia, unlike America, did not have a significant issue when it came to a conflict between white and black people, but instead had other racial issues when it came to the different ethnic groups living in the once Russian Empire.
Why defend the legacy of a man who's been dead for over half a century? It's because the ruling class likes to use Stalin as a talking point. Everywhere you can see comparisons of people to Stalin, as if he were the devil. But almost always, the United States has done the same, if not worse. It's easy to condemn the atrocities that occurred decades ago under a country that hasn't existed for about 30 years. What's harder to do is something about the atrocities of today committed by us that we have control over. While American nationalists gleefully talk about the Soviet Union's purges and the Holdemor, they remain silent about the US's ongoing support of the Yemen Civil War and the apartheid state of Israel. They ignore the brutality of the police and the growing mass surveillance program. This isn't to deflect from the bad parts of Stalin and the Soviet Union, certainly just because the US does many of the same things doesn't justify either, but after hearing criticism of the Soviet Union's secret police, prison camps, authoritarian methods of maintaining control, and how it was an undemocratic hellscape, it's time to look in the mirror.
So, a few things. One is that, whether or not Triple S means to use the US's crimes as a means of excusing the Soviets, that is the consequential outcome of his rhetoric. It's kind of like when people say, "I'm not saying it was okay for the police to kill that black guy. I'm just saying that that black guy was no angel." May or may not mean to condone police brutality in that instance, but the consequences of using that rhetoric are as such. Secondly, this is whataboutism. Plain and simple. The crimes of the United States have no bearing on the crimes of the Soviets. Is it easier to condemn the historic crimes of the Soviets than it is to condemn the current crimes of the United States? Sure, but you could say the same thing about the crimes of Nazi Germany, or apartheid South Africa, or Pinochet's Chile. It's the reason studying and learning about history is so important, so that the crimes of the past, and by extension, the victims of those crimes, aren't forgotten, no matter what crimes were being committed or who was committing them. So, yeah, that was the video. Triple S, if you're watching this, no hard feelings, but this was a terrible video that serves to excuse and obfuscate the crimes of a horrible man with a horrible legacy. I'm Man the Wall, and I'll see you next time.